So once again, we get to that point in the service where I should just shut up. We should sit down, have our amens, and go home. It's all been said, but I'm going to say more. I don't know how many of you saw the blog. I was just kind of being tongue-in-cheek and playing around this morning with this idea that Linda and I are preaching on the same text. And she was preaching at the 9:30 and now at the 11 o'clock service on the same text. And as we kind of started working through this message, we started to kind of debate with one another a little bit about what the message means. We also sort of kind of helped each other out a little bit. And then we got into this idea that, well, we're drawing completely different conclusions from this text. And yet somehow at the same time, we're somehow not contradicting ourselves. So that'll be interesting to see. I haven't heard actually what she finally came up with. But I want to start off with a story about an experience that I had in Philadelphia some years back. Of course, I used to travel a lot as working with kids who had cancer and going to hospitals and such as a musician and a storyteller. And I was doing that with one particular hospital in Philadelphia. It was one of the larger children's hospitals. And after performing, they had said, and I had rented a car and such, and so I was on my own, but they had said, got the night, I had another program in the morning, go down to South Street, which is in the south side of Philly. Some of y'all been there before? Really nice kind of entertainment area, kind of a rough mixed area too. I mean, they said, you know, go down there, but you don't want to park your car in that area. There's a neighborhood nearby that's more of a, not gated, but it's kind of a secure community, nice sort of condos and lots of lights on the street. And they said, park your car there. People kind of keeping an eye on things. And then it's about 3 blocks walk over to South Street and you'll be fine, which is exactly what I did. And of course, I had my stuff in my car. I didn't go by the hotel first because it's on the other side of the city. So I figured I'd be there for an hour or two. There was a great deli I heard about. So it was about 6 o'clock or so, not quite dark, but getting dark. And I went over crossed over, and it was beautiful. Lots of people starting to gather. It was a fun, sort of lively neighborhood. Kind of reminded me a little bit of our own Magnolia Fairmount neighborhood, although bigger and more crowded. And I went into the deli, and I ordered this amazing sandwich. And then I reached for my wallet, and I realized my wallet was in my car. I'd taken it, I forgot why, but I took my wallet out, and it was in the car. And so I turned around, and I walked back across the walkway. Traffic was getting pretty busy, but I kind of dodged some cars, got across, walked 3 blocks around the corner. It was getting dark, and as I turned the corner of my street, I saw my Toyota Camry pulling away from the curb and driving off. And as it started driving off, I ran toward it screaming and shouting, "What are you doing? That's my car!" And somebody rolled down the passenger window on the right, raised up their hand, threw me a nice little gesture, and then sped off around the corner. And my heart was pounding. I turned around and I raced back to South Street where there was a police officer who was directing traffic. And he was in the middle of directing traffic. I ran right into the street. I just ran right in through the cars, and he looked at me as though I'd gone crazy and was about to arrest me there, and I was just almost in tears. "My car's been stolen. My car's been stolen. I don't have anything." And he said, well, wait a minute. He said, "What?" And I told him the whole thing and where it was parked. And he said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes, I saw it driving off. The people were laughing at me as they drove off." And he said, "Well, do you have some ID?" And I reached for my pocket again. And I said, "No, because it's in the car." And he said, "Well, what about your contact?" I said, "Yes, my contact. It's in the car." And then I remembered everything, the instruments, the contact information, the tickets for my flight home the next afternoon. Everything was in the car. So the police officer took down information. I didn't know what the license was, and I said, "I know it was rented from Enterprise," and we tried to get some car information. They reported it stolen. The police officer gave me a ride to the hotel. That night I was in a panic, because then I had to find out. I couldn't remember who to call as my contact, so I was calling the hospital, trying to connect with whoever it was that I could get to come get me for the program the next day. Well, the police officer was very sympathetic with me. And I was amazed at how nice he was, because, in fact, the police officer ended up getting me the next morning and taking me to the hospital. And they pulled and found a guitar for me so that I could have a guitar to do the program. And I did the morning's program. And my heart was sunk. I still didn't know how I was going to do the ticket, all of that stuff. And I just was so angry that night before. I'm a compassionate person, I like to think of. I didn't really want God to strike them down dead. But I thought if their car ran out of gas and they were stuck in the middle of nowhere, that there'd be at least some pleasure to that. So I just kept trying to imagine that in my head, and I kind of saw my darker side, to be honest with you. After the performance, the police officer again came and picked me up. It was one of his partners, and they were really being really nice about the whole thing. And they were taking me back to the airport and said, you know what, we probably should go down to the station one more time and just double check everything, see if the car had been turned in. So as we were making our way to the station, which was a branch station over by South Street, he said, now you want to show me the street again. And as we were driving down the street towards South Street, we were pulling past the houses, and I suddenly noticed there are 4 streets that look exactly alike. This whole neighborhood complex was all the same kinds of brownstone houses. And I looked at him as we were going, and he said, now which street? And I said, wait a minute, turn down this one. And we turned down the street, and there was my car. Right where it had been. Right where I had parked it. Right where I might have seen it had I not already overreacted to my fear and my anxiety and my prejudice that I'd already been sort of primed for and determined that my car, in fact, had been stolen. Well, the officer was more than nice about it, but I can imagine what he said when he got back to the station. Another Texan lost in Philadelphia with the street right in front of him. You know, it's interesting, I think, what fear can sometimes do to us. Fear often causes us to overreact. It makes it easy to jump to conclusions and to start to grasp for whatever anchors or whatever beliefs or whatever opinions that we can hold on to, even whatever ideals we can grab hold of in order to sort of secure what we have or secure what we believe. And sometimes these fears and these choices that we adopt to deal with them can create what I consider kind of an institutional reality. And we've talked about this before in here, this idea that institutionalization is one of those things that we have to constantly deal with in a dialectic kind of fashion, in a questioning, opening kind of fashion. But the reality is that fear is a driving force no matter how enlightened we are. We are so institutionalized to our own realities, which is why I kind of came up with this title, Simulacrum, Similitudes, and Other Renderings. And I'm sure you all immediately, when you saw this, you got on your phone and you started looking up, what's a simulacrum? What is that? And right? No? Not even curious. You're not going to go home and study this afterwards? Probably not. Just going to chalk it up to Tom's weird way of thinking. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for your honesty. Appreciate that. Well, the Jewish temple life had sort of been subject to this whole reality of institutionalization. In the time of Jesus' story of this text that we read today, it's really a place where in Jewish reality, we sometimes see it as an oppressive, as a violent, as a really negative reality. And in some ways, it certainly was. It was an oppressive reality. Religiously, it was oppressive. But at the same time, this whole Monty Python skit I threw in there just for reality, the Roman Empire gave the world a good portion of its civilization. And even in the Jewish time, in their day, in that time, the reality was that there was a lot more that they had that they would not have had. But there was still this sort of blasphemous reality that they lived in the midst of. Number one was the idea of oppression, of the idea of not having their own land, which was so deeply integrated into their sense of who they are, who the Jewish faith is, or what the Jewish faith is, this sense of covenant and land and a place. But at the same time, there was this sense of blasphemy. I mean, the emperor was worshipped, essentially. And there's only one God. So there was that reality. But over time, what happens with institutional realities? What happens with oppressive, fearful sorts of realities? People accommodate, people sort of adapt in ways that are somewhat contradictory, even hypocritical, and yet at the same time, they provide some sense of security. And so the temple leadership, the temple rulers, the temple authorities, often were the first ones to move to that sort of status. And they found themselves accommodating the Roman Empire in lots of different ways. Now, again, for the common, ordinary Jewish person going to the temple, it was just one more miserable sort of thing to adapt to have to take on more taxes. Sort of like our own oppressive realities sometimes, when it just seems like one more thing we have to deal with, we just sort of accommodate it over time. And we adjust. I won't say we evolve, but we improvise. And we sort of live with things. And in reality, the Jewish reality was that a lot of them had begun to sort of accommodate and live with that reality the same way that we know people who live in oppressive situations themselves, whether it's an abusive relationship, whether it's a habitual pattern that seems too difficult to break, whether it's our own tendency that we can't ever change that thing that we keep wanting to change about ourselves. Sometimes the reality is it's just easier to live with the discomfort. It's easier to live with the familiarity of the problem than it is to branch out and change the reality around us. That's what Jesus comes into. Jesus comes into this reality where there's a little bit of apathy, there's a little bit of ambivalence, at the same time that there's this tension. Now, I want to suggest to you that we're in that reality today because of this idea of simulacrum, and it's really hard to say. Anybody know where it came from? Jean Baudrillard was a French postmodernist philosopher. You figured that out, didn't you? Oh, I knew that, yeah. Yeah, it's my brother. He's like that. He was a philosopher, died in 1990. No, I'm sorry, died in 2007. But in the 1980s and 1990s, he came up with this theory of what he called simulacrums and similitudes, similarities. The idea was that reality sometimes begins to take on its own reality. Now, Adam Smith, who was sort of one of our founding fathers of our economic theory, he proposed early on that economics was going to be, as an example, was going to be centered around utility, that productivity would be centered around what people needed. And you can look back, and for generations, that seems to be the way the world was designed. That seemed to be the way the world moved. And so productivity was the motivation. But if you remember back at 9/11, one of the things that George Bush had said, right after all of the attacks, after the attacks had happened, just within a week, one of his big encouraging messages was, one of his rallying points, you remember what it was? Go buy stuff. Get out and buy stuff. Well, on the that's not a bad thing. We need to stimulate the economy, but the reality is that the economy is no longer an economy that's driven by productivity. It's an economy that's driven by consumption. But we don't think in those terms anymore because it's become our reality. So I'm watching this wonderful ad. My son, not my son, who's not my younger son's here, but my older son who's over here, they just recently bought this great car, a Subaru Outback. Anybody in here have one?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. You have two. So if you've seen the Subaru Outback advertisements, I'm thinking, I want to go get one. I mean, these people are wonderful. They have adventures. They're out the Grand Canyon. They're hugging trees where their grandparents first met. Their parents are hugging trees. I mean, Subaru Outback people are enlightened. It has nothing to do with the car. But that's our reality, right? Our reality is a simulacrum. It's an imitation of what reality might be. It's an idea. And when reality becomes imitations of imitations, we fail to see the big picture because we get trapped in that kind of reality. That's the reality that Jesus found himself in. The institutional reality of the temple was such that it was hard to see past their noses. It's the same for us today. It is hard sometimes to see past our noses. Now, some of us are certainly more enlightened than others. And so maybe we don't have a problem questioning. We don't have a problem sort of always putting things in perspective, always sort of being a little skeptical, a little critical, trying to analyze relationships. Some of us do that pretty naturally. But the fact of our culture is that, in fact, we're surrounded with a reality that is kind of fabricated by the reality itself, and it becomes self-perpetuating. That's reality television over the last decade has exploded. But when you watch it, you're thinking, who are these people? And then you realize everybody's those people. There's a whole generation of people whose identities are based on imitations of reality, and who then become that imitation. They imitate the imitations. We imitate the imitations. Well, that's what Baudrillard was arguing when he came up with this whole concept. It's not something that is a pure evil. It's a reality that happens when things become so institutionalized. Then you have somebody come in who tries to kind of change things up because they can see past their noses. You have someone like Jesus who comes into this picture and sees this reality. Now, this is where I had some fun with my wife as we were talking through this. Because the typical response to this text is that they were trying to trap Jesus, and what happened? Jesus trapped them. Because he said, show me a denarius, show me a coin. And here's a Jewish leader, a Jewish official who pulls out a Roman coin with Caesar's face on it. Something that you should never have as a spiritual authority, number one. And number two, they were in the temple area, something you would never have in the temple because it's a graven image. And therefore, he trapped the one trying to trap him. Now, I would say that that's where a lot of exegesis goes, and I don't want to argue with years and years of exegesis, but I do that anyway. Just because I sometimes wonder if Jesus wasn't even smarter than that. That he wasn't simply trying to entrap. He was literally, as he often did, turning reality upside down and saying, you aren't even seeing past your nose here. And so I talked with my wife, and then she shared with me something she discovered. She said, did you know I found in this study that the word Jesus uses in there, show me what image is on the coin, is not the Greek word like show me your face, like show me that image. It's the Hebrew word for creator from Genesis. As if he's saying, not show me the imitation on the coin, but show me who your creator is. Show me the creator on that coin. So Jesus literally simply points past the reality and says, there's such a bigger reality here that we're not even seeing, that you're not even connecting with because you have become so buried. You have become so engrossed in this imitation of a reality that we don't see past our noses. He wasn't being coy at all, but in fact was pointing to a bigger picture. So I want to make just a couple of quick points. The first one is that this text is often used in stewardship moments. I know we've got some retired clergy and such folks here, and oftentimes this one has been sort of associated with that. There's nothing about taxes here. There's nothing that really you can use about taxes here. It may say, in fact, give to Caesar what's Caesar, give to God what's God. It's not what that's about. It's not about a taxation system. The reality is whether or not the dominating system is Roman Empire, or whether it's Hitler, or whether it's communism, or whether it's biased or prejudiceness, or whether it's our own self-absorption, whatever the dominating empire that we find ourselves institutionally blind to, that's what's being addressed here. Not where our monies should go particularly, but what reality drives us. That's what I think is being addressed here. And the second thing is this, that when Jesus is asking what coin is on there, I think we have to ask ourselves, what reflection is on this coin. I think we have to ask ourselves not so much what is the creator on this coin, but more who are we in relationship to the creation. I think we are being challenged to look past the system and to see the bigger picture. Who are we in relationship? It's not, to me, about the division of property. It's bigger than that. It's about our relationship to everything. It's what's at the core of our relationship. And when you start thinking about that, I have to admit, it bothers me. Because in reality, if you just come onto my office, I like my stuff. And I travel all over, and when I traveled all over, I love to collect stuff, and I like to have representations of different things that represent experiences in my life, or that connect me to some part of my history. I would say I like my car, but all you have to do is look at what I drive, and then you'd realize these cars aren't that big a deal to him. Except, yes, oh, there's my son now. I talked about your car, but don't worry about it. You'll have to ask somebody later what I said. For me, it's like a lot of things. The car represents a connection to me because it's a car that belonged to someone's father who died here in the church. There used to be a youth in my youth group, so there's a connection. And I'm the only car also that has white walls. So next time you see a little SUV with white walls, you know it's me because there's nobody else with them. And the other car was given to me, actually, when we kind of a deal that was done with, some of you all remember, and now I don't remember, Ronnie Franks, who used to be in the band here years and years ago. And it was one of his cars and his kid's car. To me, it's about connection. But even that gets in the way. Even that sometimes gets in the way of seeing the bigger picture. And I think what this text invites us to do, and what I want to challenge you with, is to look past the tendencies to let fear decide, to let anxiety decide for us, to let the impressions of fear decide for us how we relate to the world. The Ebola crisis, the economic crises, the political crises, perhaps what should honestly drive everything we do is the big picture, and to ask ourselves, how are we connected to whatever's going on? And when we figure that out, not how are we imitating, how are we reflecting that connection?